Hey, Comics Cubers. Sean Kyle Manaloto joins us today to talk about his comic Godhark, which is an official entry into the Philippine International Comics Festival's official selection. Before we jump into the interview, please be reminded that we do have a Patreon. I'll put the link down below. There are no tiers on it. There's only a $1 per month tier. Basically, think of it as a tip jar. If you like what we do here on the Comics Cube, if you want to help keep the Comics Cube going, could really use a little bit of help. So please, if you're feeling generous, click on the link down below. Here's the rest of the interview. Enjoy talking about Godhark with Sean Manaloto. Here's my first question that I ask everyone.
Yeah.
Why do you love comics?
I love it as a medium because it's super accessible. That's nothing that's what I came to realize because in terms of like media nowadays, you have movies, you have games, you have music. It's one of the most accessible things because it's not like a novel where you have to think a little more about it or imagine it. It's right there, you got to read. That's basically it's a movie that you read. So I've always been I've always had an affinity with that stuff for as long as I've been reading, really. And that's why I love it. I love reading. I love reading it. I love making it. Even though I don't read a lot of comics, I love the comics that I have read and are still reading. So,
When did you first discover comics?
like way back when I was 4 years old, roughly the same time as I started drawing, really, which was 4 years old. I've been drawing for basically like 23 years now. So yeah, age reveal. Around that time, I discovered. Well, of course, you discover Superman and Batman first. I was introduced to them first, and then I realized that Marvel exists with Thor, the Hulk. I was actually introduced to these characters via the game Marvel vs. Capcom, the first one on the
Uh,
PlayStation. So I discovered them, and then my dad told me they're actually from comics. That he used to have Avengers comics and an Avengers action figure line that he never opened because collector's value. So I discovered that, and then I discovered comics through games. So on the PlayStation, you had Marvel vs. Capcom. I didn't know that Capcom. I thought Capcom was comics too, but they were primarily games,
yeah.
and Marvel had just been ported to create that collab. And then back when my relatives from the States, my uncle from the States, introduced me to the now defunct Dreamcast, I was introduced to Spawn through Dreamcast because Spawn had a game out in the late 90s or the early 2000s, I believe.
I remember the
Where the
Spawn game.
Yeah, the Spawn game where it was like this arena fighter.
Yeah.
That was cool. Short lived, but really cool. So, and then I found out Spawn is written by Todd McFarlane and it's a comic. So I was like, that's cool. So I was like really early in my life, at around 7 years old. I discovered the darker side of comics, like the anti-hero stuff,
Mhm.
and I had more exposure to that as opposed to like the classic heroes like Superman, Batman, Captain America, what have you. So yeah.
Did when did you realize that you wanted to make comics?
Uh, I wanted to make again. I wanted to make games first. I thought game development or getting into game development was easy. It's not. Although there are a lot of indies nowadays and a lot of programs that make it easy, it still requires more than one person to maintain your sanity to create. But I just sort of made comics because I could draw. So when I was around like preteens, like around 11, I started to I started to get a bunch of bond paper, like around 20 pieces, and then staple them together, and then started making a story, like actual comics that sadly I gave away to some neighbors back when we lived in a condo. So back when my family and I lived in a condo. So I wish I had those now because I understand the value of it now, like looking back. But yeah, I used to draw comics. I drew comics initially because I just thought, hey, this seems easy for me. It's something I could do by myself. Um, and I draw, so I can draw sequentially. And then I just kept doing it eventually. That's like what got me here. So
It's very obvious talking to you for 5 minutes and also reading Godhark that you are very, very much a gamer. Uh,
yep.
what games and comics went into your style? Like, what are you most influenced by?
Okay, in terms of games, I can go on forever. Like this interview is gonna take like forever, but off the top of my head, in terms of world building, there's a game. There are games. There's a game series called Dragon Age. Um, that's fairly recent. I haven't played the first game, but I have played every game since, and also there's a new one coming out in October. Very inspiring world building there. Then there's this old game called Summoner 2 for the PS2. Also one of those obscure titles that um surprisingly if you play it has also solid world building, and it was totally high fantasy. Like it was a classical RPG that I believe Dragon Age took from like that sort of archetype. And then writing wise, there's again an older game back from the late 90s on the PlayStation and Dreamcast called Soul Reaver, part of the Legacy of Kain series of games. So it's about vampires and stuff. But the writing at the time was so sophisticated, people don't really give it the credit it deserves for being very like Shakespearean in terms of video games, where there was actually a budget for good voice acting. There was actually a really high concept script. And I was introduced to that when I was a child, and it freaked me out. Like the intro to that game freaked me out. Now I love it and I memorize it. And every now and then I would watch the cutscenes again, and then I'm reminded like that's kind of how I write. Like it's ingrained in me to have those exchanges between characters when it matters. Like, not all the time because it's like grandiose writing. So like when it matters, that's sort of my influence. And then in terms of comics, I don't really read much comics. I off the top of my head, Hellboy, Hellboy's art style and paneling is very inspiring to me. Is I mean, you notice a Godhark, it's the paneling is really like simple most of the time.
Yeah,
Like
but
there's
I don't
barely.
think I would have guessed that you read Hellboy by reading Godheart.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I don't think so.
I guess that's cool. But Hellboy's paneling to me was like I. So it's really so there is such a thing as simple paneling, but there's also this depth to it. There's this depth in the detail, and at the same time, the simplicity of what Mignola is writing. So I adapted that into Godhark now, and also um, even before Mignola, I was really into Joe Mad's art. So
Ah,
Battle Chasers is the second book I would say influenced me. I actually recently got my hands on the Battle Chasers anthology. Like I got it from a Phil Bars recently,
yeah.
and like after tracking it down for like almost a decade now, I finally have a copy. So yeah, those are my top two comic influences, if you ask.
Yeah, Joe Mad was the biggest thing there for a while.
Super, yeah. I was
Yeah.
doing games, so
Now and then he stopped comics to do games. What do
yeah.
you so you were talking about your Joe Mad being an influence on your art, Mignola being an influence on your paneling, and various games being an influence on your writing. Are there any specific games that influenced your illustration style?
Yeah, that's easy. I mean, ever since I played the first Dark Souls, I've been like invested in that type of game, in that dark fantasy genre ever since. So back in 2013, I saw the trailer for the sequel to Dark Souls, Dark Souls 2. So Dark Souls 2, despite being the black sheep, like if you ask any gamer out there, it's like they'll say Dark Souls 2 is like the black sheep of that whole like spiritual succession. That's what got me into Dark Souls as a whole. And then I started following that company as they made games. So primarily their inspiration is Berserk, which is a manga, so which is also still comics. So there's a lot. There's heavily they heavily borrow from the themes and also that aesthetic. So Berserk translates into like they put it in Dark Souls, and then Dark Souls influenced how I illustrate things. But there's a the thing with Godhark is it takes more inspiration from Dark Souls as sort of like a spine, like that's sort of the backbone where there's an exaggeration, but there's also a sort of realism. There's a fantastic realism and this exaggeration to make them look larger than life that I combined into the illustration. And a lot of that though is influenced and informed by like the music that I listen to, which of course is metal, as you and I have discussed,
We
as
have
you put in
discussed
your
this.
review. Yeah, it is metal. Like a lot of people, you're not the first person to say it is like a metal a metal comic, so to speak. So yeah, that's it's Dark Souls, and then it's the music I listen to. Godhark in a way is sort of layered, where I'm inspired, of course, by the progression in games. Like you develop, like you as like when you keep going through the game, you get upgrades and whatever, and then like the tone would shift. That's common, by the way, in games like Dark Souls, where progressively the tone would become more and more like dangerous, or more and more like, oh, I'm actually fighting divine things now, or like I'm fighting Lovecraftian eldritch deities now. So there's like a surface level. Godheart, it's mostly like the surface of the world is kind of like the more accessible metal. Like you have like power metal, you have, just heavy metal, like let's say, like of course, like Iron Maiden, those guys that started it all. And then as you progress through the story, there's this, especially one of the characters, she has this hidden rage inside her.
Yeah.
And that's when I bring out like the death metal influence, the black metal influence. So I listen to everything basically. I listen to the accessible stuff, and the stuff that takes a little more like getting used to, like extreme metal they call it. So black metal, death metal, that stuff is like extreme metal. That's the label they have for it right now.
Do you listen to it while working?
Yeah, I do. Like, I mean, I'm not the type of person to like it has to match the vibe of the drawing I'm making. I listen to anything while drawing, but yeah, it's primarily like metal. If it's not the indie music that my wife has introduced to me, it's always metal. So yeah,
Okay, let's talk about Godhark.
let's go.
You want people to read Godhark, and you have to summarize it in 5 sentences or less. What do you say?
So okay, Godhark is it's set in a high fantasy universe with an industrial sort of deal. So there's a technological advancement in Godhark. And basically, the summary is three gods have waged war, none of them survived. And since that fantasy world, since the inhabitants of the Godheart universe are so used to having divinity rule them, they're finding ways through mortal means to create new gods because they're so used to living with like being ruled by gods. And the only way to do that is to assemble the God Heart, which is another group of three mortals who are going to go through the trials that make a god. And at the end of it, like they hope to ascend to godhood.
And how did you come up with Godhark? And when did you come up with Godhark?
Okay, so some of the characters that you read about in God Heart, they've been in my head for like years now, like further than 10 years. Some of those characters are like more than 10 years old. Some of those characters are like less than a year old, and so I've always had these OCs, so to speak, original characters that I feel like they could inhabit that world. So I put them all in. I started with the characters first and then built the world around them. So with Godheart, um, those characters that you see there, they've been with me for a long time, and then I developed the story around them. And initially, it wasn't supposed to be turning like about being a god, right? It wasn't supposed to be that. It was supposed to be. I actually can't remember what it was supposed to be about because that was when I got the publishing deal, when I got Comiket to publish the work. It was pretty much directionless. Like, what's the goal here? What's everyone trying to do? So I'm like, actually, I don't know. So um, there was a driving force there to come up with something that there had to be an inciting action, and then there had to be a resolution that could or could not be reached by the protagonists. And I already had it. I already had it at the back of my mind. It was supposed to be for the betterment of the world that they live in, because they know that the world they live in is like somehow getting worse or slowly dying. And I had to think of something that actually made sense. So if it's a fantasy world, gods exist. If the gods die, and if the world is used to being ruled by gods that they know exist, what happens when the gods die? So you have like doubt sets in, existential crises set in. Oh, gods can actually die, nothing is sacred, something like that. So it used to be called Eldritch Engines. And Paolo from Comic Cat told me like, why is it called Eldritch Engines? And I'm like, it's a cool name and not much else. Not much else. And then over Discord, I had a few friends like I had a few friends telling me that, Sean, I'm sorry, man, but I searched up eldritchengines.com because I know you want to make a site. But unfortunately, it's some kind of clothing brand that took the name for their site. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding me, man? A clothing line? And then I sort of like I was sort of already thinking of like workarounds, like it could be called the Eldritch Engines Saga or something like that. Then I came up with Godhark, like it's like out of nowhere. I'm like Godhark. I don't know where it came from. Like I had to change the name, like that
That's
dire
where
that
it came from.
yeah, that's where it came from. Like I had to change the name just in case Godhark as a comic gets big, and just in case the clothing brand that had the name Eldritch Engines gets big. I'm trying to avoid a lawsuit. It's like a panic dive sort of situation. Godhark came in, and I'm like, that's good. Let's search up Godhark on Google, see what comes out. Nothing came out. So I was like, okay, I win. I'm gonna revise the story for it to fit, for the name to fit the narrative. So it was called Eldritch Engines actually up until the second issue that came out. So up until issue two, it was called that. But it's a good thing they never said the name of the, like, they never said, these are the Eldritch Engines of, that typical trope. And then when issue three came around, that's when it introduced the concept of actually there being something called the Godheart, which is the three mortals who are set to ascend.
Yeah.
So there can be multiple Godhearts throughout the universe, but the ones that become gods are the Godheart that matters, if that makes sense. So that's where the name came from.
When did you get the publishing deal? Did you already have issues out?
Yeah, I had zero and one out. I pitched it late 2018. Um, I pitched it to Sila Paulo and stuff like that, and then it was really raw. Like I couldn't compress my story in the timeline they gave me because I was super passionate about it. And it's the first time I've ever pitched anything. So my PowerPoint was overly complicated, and unfortunately I wasn't the one clicking, so I couldn't really tell it how I wanted it and ran out of time. And then like the main criticism was, or the main criticisms were, like, why is it called Eldritch Engines? What's everyone trying to do? Where's the Filipino character? Like that stuff. Like, yeah, where is the Filipino character? So like like those issues came out, and then I kind of felt like I had to change the whole thing up for a while because I hadn't done a pitch before. But I was reassured now. I was like, okay, just keep with the vision, keep with it. And then long story short, I think we're here now. Godhark is Godhark. I was given up until 2022. That's when I was given until MIBF to finish
Mm-hmm.
the whole book, and it came out on MIBF 2022. So yeah, 4 years.
4 years. So you were 23.
Yep.
Now, thematically, you've told us what happens in Godhark.
Okay.
Thematically, what would you say Godhark is about?
Yeah. So, well, Godheart to me is about this being united, like no matter what differences you actually have. Say, like the power of belief. It Beliefs are something that shouldn't really be, it shouldn't really make everyone enemies. It should be something that unites people. And usually
Yeah,
The
Unity
most
is good.
yeah, the most powerful people are usually the ones to unite them, to unite everyone, right? So that's sort of the ambition of a few characters in Godhark, is to be the most powerful dude out there, and then say this everything that you believe in, like you shouldn't be using it against each other. You should be using it to bring everyone together. Like variety in beliefs is fine, but violence in defense and like in enforcing that belief is where the line should be drawn. So it's kind of like this anti-war unity sort of deal, because I mean, I think a lot of the great fantasy stories are anti-war. I mean, Lord of the Rings was anti-war. Tolkien
Yeah.
hated war with a passion because he's been there. So Metal Gear is anti-war, and I think honestly, the Metal Gear series has this imprint on my storytelling too, where we're trying to tell the same thing, only in different, totally different universes. Like it's like opposite sides of the spectrum. So yeah, it's kind of this anti-war deal. It's reflected by this one character named Hisaru in the book, and she's on the front cover. She has like horns and everything. You'd expect her. That's the thing. You'd expect her to be the last person to not wish for peace. You know what I mean? Or rather, the
You're the
last
last
person
person
to
to wish
wish
for
for peace.
peace. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You'd be the last. She looked like the last person to do that, but really, she's been through a lot of war. Her whole life is war. She was convinced that she was built for war up until she realized, if I'm part of the Godheart, there's actually a chance for peace, not just for my country, but for everywhere. So yeah, it's this anti-war, pro-unity sort of deal that I'm trying to convey.
You mentioned Hisaru. You may as well also describe the other characters in Godheart
All
for
right, so I'll
with
describe
no
Hisaru
spoilers.
briefly.
With no
Yeah,
spoilers.
of course. I want you guys to read the book. So, um, Hisaru first, like we've talked about her just a few seconds ago, but Hisaru is a warrioress from the east. So she's inspired by like the Japanese mythology, but she's actually usually what inspired her is usually depicted as evil. So you have the ogres like the Oni with the horns and stuff. She resembles them. She's not exactly them, but um she resembles that kind of trope. Now you'd think she's evil, you'd think she's a monster, but she's actually a really noble person. And then the other two protagonists we have are Emrit. So Emrit, she's sort of this elvish, faunish being they call Waldish. So the Waldish people are from the Walds, which is basically an interconnected forest type environment, and they're the typical elvish um, archetype there, or rather, they're inspired by that whole elven thing. And her whole deal is because of the recent terrorist attacks by something called the Sect of Men, which is where the antagonist comes in. Alchemy, which is Emrit's passion, has been prohibited. It's been prohibited for like 2 years ongoing. So this makes her angry. She has a sick mom, and she can't brew something that would help without getting caught. And so she's embarking on a quest that she doesn't know is actually something that might put her on the path to becoming a goddess. So she has to be really careful in that regard and really get to know what she's getting into. So that's the second character. And then the third character's name is Lorison. Now, Lorison, this is where, like, if you've played Dark Souls, this is the kind of guy you'd expect to be in a Dark Souls game. He's not optimistic. He's pissed off. He's not really happy about things. And I mean, I understand. He's actually supposed to be this renowned figure in the West, or rather, like where the knights in the story come from, where the whole like armored armored people with swords come from. Like he's supposed to be a high ranking member of that. He was an arch knight, so to speak, and people expected him to be somewhere else in the story, but he appears right when these two other characters, si Emrit and Hisaru, these characters kind of cross paths, and then they're walking the path to godhood without them exactly truly fathoming it. And then he comes in, and then he's like, "Well, I guess we're forming the Godhark now. So let's do that." I have some. I'm really angry at the antagonist because I have personal ties to him. So what the hell? Let's might as well try to do this even if we fail. So yeah, those are the three protects of the comic.
And together they make the Godhark.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sean, I've seen your work since 2022. You were part of the official PICOF selection, the original PICOF selection.
Yep.
But it took me a while to get to your comic because your comic is, how do I say this? The most expensive out of all of the PICOF guys.
I
And
got it.
the reason for that is because your comic is also the biggest.
It is hefty. Yes. Yeah.
And also, I would say has the highest production value.
Thank you. Yeah. It's what can I say? I really like the work. So yeah. I mean, that is true.
You're using glossy paper. Not everyone, the PICOF selection uses glossy paper, and this is 6 issues worth of material.
Yeah.
Now, 6 issues worth of material. After reading this, and I also bought issue 7 off of you when I saw you at PICOF this year. One could read just this book and be satisfied, but you're
That
going to continue.
Yep, that's right. So issues 0 to 6, or book one, it I designed it to be a standalone. Thankfully, the critiques from the publisher, PICOF, they really helped me create something that could stand on its own. Of course, there's this huge story in my head that I want to tell through subsequent books. So book one is far from being like even the end of, like, we're not almost done, we're actually just starting. But the publisher gave me the right pushes, the right prods to create something that if you read it, you can stop there. But as a creator, like me and my wife who's on board now, we're not stopping there. So if you want to know more past book one, you're most likely going to be in it for life. That's sort of the approach that I'm putting out there, is that book one's a standalone. I always tell this to people who are buying. Like, book one's a standalone, but issue seven's out. This is the continuation. This is the direct start of the sequel. So yeah, if you're satisfied with book one, there's no need to jump into whatever happens next. Although I'd really like for you to see it. So yeah.
This interview would not be complete if I didn't ask you about your process for character design and your
Yeah.
fellow character designer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so how does that go?
Okay, so Hisaru, Emrit, Lorison, the three protagonists, and actually, well, technically everyone in the book, except for this character called the Wanderer, they were kind of winged. Actually, I kind of winged their designs as I was writing the book. So I started drawing them in the pages first, and then made the turnarounds for them, and the whole concept, the traditional concept art layout for these characters. So Hisaru, like, I just felt like she should have this piece on her. She should have a garland, like the beads, prayer beads. Like, technically, you draw them naked on a page when you start, and then you just put whatever works on them if you feel like visually it makes you happy. It's a really raw, organic, impromptu process that, honestly, like, I want to get away from with book two. Because book two, I feel like I want to take a more traditional approach to how I structure book two. But book one is a lot of winging. Even in terms of narrative, it was winging. So everything narratively is a reaction to the past issue. So issue one is a reaction to issue zero, issue two is a reaction to issue one, and so on and so forth. But yeah, the characters there are mostly winged. Like, for issue one, like the knight characters there and the antagonist, they did not have prior designs. I just thought, what should what should the knight commander and his underling knights look like? Okay, they should have blue armor because Lorisin has red armor. The point of Lorisin was he's kind of like the antithesis, even though he was one of them before.
Mm-hmm.
He has red armor because it it was like a burial rite, like something that is unheard of in their culture. Like I had those while designing it, and that was like going. I didn't think of these things before I designed them. I thought of these things as I was designing them on the pages itself. So a lot of the process is winging it for book one. When it got to the antagonist, I was like, what should a cultist look like? What should a fanatical like religious nut look like in a fantasy setting? He's the most, if you ask me, the Grand Daemonarch or the antagonist for this one, book one. He's a very stereotypical, full of himself cultist. He's got a red hood and not much else. So he's got a red hooded robe basically, and then underneath he's this massive like tumorous growths because he's experimented with blood magic, which is of course like an illegal or really frowned upon and forbidden magic in the Godhark universe. So he's dabbled in that and he's paid the price. And that's kind of what went into designing that character for the book, and so on and so forth. So the two characters that actually have had designs prior to Godhark that I've had in my mind for like a long time are the eldest and the wanderer. So the eldest, she's the only one who has like these huge angel wings,
Yeah.
and these huge horns, and she's almost a mix between like a dragon and an angel, which I think is a fantastic mix. Like people should do that more, like, in my opinion. So I did I did it myself, right? So like the eldest has been around for as long as the wanderer has been around in terms of my personal lore, also but also in terms of the book's lore. So if you were to look at their attire, you could tell that they were more ancient than anything else in the book. Everyone is like wearing this sort of medieval to like semi Victorian era outfits, like sort of steampunky, like that period piece sort of like attire. But the eldest and the wanderer, they just wear cloth, and there some gold adorns them, and that's pretty much it. Like these guys are clearly from another age, but they're not out of place in that universe. So that was like the whole philosophy I wanted to import when writing the book. But a lot of it honestly is winging. Like a lot of it is I winged it, like bluntly, like to speak bluntly. Yeah.
Can you tell me where we can buy your books?
Yeah. So the books are available at Fully Booked Green Hills and Fully Booked BGC, I believe. There are still copies there. Shopee and Lazada are apparently on vacation, so I'll ask them about that. But yes, you can get it from Shopee and Lazada. You can also get it from the PICOF Secret HQ bookstore. If you sign a form, you could get your copy. It'll be delivered to you anywhere in the Philippines. For people who live in the US, Hot Tropics sells it. All you have to do is order on their site. They also sell rather digital copies on Gumroad. There's a bundle for book one, but I usually sell individual copies there because the pandemic didn't give me time to like print those out individually. So there's digital copies for each chapter on Gumroad. Yeah, that's pretty much where you can buy. Pretty much most of the places you can buy it. Yeah.
And where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, so you can follow Godhark on Instagram and Facebook. It's just Godhark. And then you can follow The Art of Sane Kyle or Sane_Kyle on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Kara, everywhere. So Sane_Kyle or The Art of Sane Kyle. You'll be directed to every social media that I have. And then my wife, who's designing the characters for issue 7 up, like issue 7 onwards, michfrank.exe. That's michfranc.exe on Instagram and Twitter. So that's where you can follow us.
And if people want to say hi to you, keeping in mind that this interview will go up in October, where can we see you for the rest of the year?
October, I'll be doing Comic-Con, and that'll be my last convention. Actually, October Comic-Con will be my last convention for this year, because November onwards, I'll be taking a break for a while. And then you can expect book 2 to be out around Q2 to Q3 next year. Uh,
Really?
yeah, I'm working
That
hard on
quick?
it. Well, I try. Yeah, I'm making a few life adjustments to meet that date. So let's just say that. Yeah.
Good luck, Sean. It's a
Thank you
great
so much.
book. It's a great looking book. It is, like I said, the most metal Filipino comic I have ever read.
Thank you. You.
Um, and I wanted to ask you one more question. This is
Yeah.
my last question.
Okay.
A lot of the time when I interview Filipino comics creators, there is, because you touched on this a while back, there is a whole theme of like identity and why are we using, why do we continue to use Filipino mythological creatures, or we're looking back at Filipino tradition. And I think with Godhark, if you don't know how to look for the Filipino parts of it, you won't find it,
Okay. Yeah.
right?
So
But if you do know how to look, you'll know it's there. So,
yeah.
is that a conscious choice on your end to not make it look like a lot of the traditional Filipino
Yeah. Okay.
direction?
So I'll try to make this as concise as I can. It does exist. Issue 7 features the Aswang.
Yes.
Okay. So the Aswang are this race that are yet to be introduced as a whole. There's a whole backstory behind them. They're a huge part of the world because the East and the West, the West is ruled by like these humanoid looking creatures, but the East, did I say the West was ruled by the, yeah, okay. So the West is like, the West are the Westerners, you have like European, like UK inspired, like the whole backstory. But the East, the Aswang are actually the monarchy of the East. So you'll be seeing some backstory issue 7 and up. Because the only character we've introduced who is actually an Aswang does exist in book 1, but she's not really like obviously flaunting that about her. Like she doesn't, you wouldn't think she was Aswang right away until you actually do find out that, oh, okay, well, she is one. But we'll touch up on that um, in issue 7 onwards because it's something that it wasn't really a conscious decision. No, I was just really honest about my work. Honestly, I really didn't know much about Filipino mythology when I started making the book because most of the stuff that I was raised on is like Western. But
Is video games.
yeah, so yeah, it's like I'm thankful and I'm lucky to have like been raised on that. But I wanted to do something now with our mythology because I feel like I can put my own spin to it where it wouldn't feel too like overdone. You know what I mean? It's not like there's like this oversaturation of mythology themed stuff in comics that we have here in the Philippines. It's that I feel like because everything in Godhark is my own twist on things,
Yeah.
why not adapt why not adapt the mythology from where I am really from where I was born, and then put my own twist on it in such a way that it actually does fit Godheart. And it's not too tacky the way I like. It's not like I sprinkle that in there and be like, okay, you guys have your Aswang, your Bakunawa references, your Sige Narugan and stuff like that. It's contained within the Godheart universe. It's an original universe based on mythology that we like, multiple mythologies and multiple influences, but it is there. So I'm making a conscious effort now to introduce my mythology, the mythology that I was born with, that came from the place I was born. So I'm doing that now. So yeah.
Congratulations, Sean. My biggest wish for you is that Godhark eventually becomes a video game.
Hell yeah, that's my biggest wish too. Thank you, Doi, for having me.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so much.
much, Sean.